Hello! Before today's episode about Divergent, I wanted to give a quick content warning. In this episode, we're going to be discussing topics such as sexual assault, suicide, religion, and abusive relationships. If any of those topics make you feel uncomfortable, feel free to skip this episode, no hard feelings at all. Also, please keep in mind that all critiques, positive and negative, are just our own, and no offense is intended to the author or anyone who enjoys this series. Happy listening.
Y'all are going to erudite, so I'll join you in erudite, and we can all be together.
And then we'll make podcasts. And welcome back to Nostalgia Club. We are back with another episode of Season 4. I'm Victoria, and I'm joined by my hosts,
Jino!
And Michael.
Hooray! Today we are talking about Divergent. I know, it is the year 2025 and we are talking about Divergent.
No more prescient to time.
This is a book written by Veronica Roth. It came out in 2011, which is something I was surprised by. And it's very fascinating. It's in the era of the dystopian YA novel craze.
The boom.
And personally, I read a lot of dystopian YA novels. So I feel somewhat qualified to talk about this. But I also barely remembered Divergent very much at all. Before we get into everything, let's just give a very brief basic premise of the story. We won't get into the nitty-gritty details because I'm sure we'll talk about it. And hopefully, well, I assume that you probably have encountered Divergent if you're listening to this episode. This book is set in a post-apocalyptic Chicago where society is divided into 5 factions. Each faction has a trait that they hold above all else. So there's Abnegation, who's selfless, Amity, who are the peaceful. Also, side note, Abnegation is in leadership because it's basically like, we'll give leadership to the people who don't want it, and that's like the best for society. Amity, who are the peaceful, are in charge of agriculture and farming, so they basically distribute the food to everyone. Or they grow the food. And then I think Abnegation distributes the food.
Doesn't matter.
It's like, that's the thing I was a little confused about. Anyways, Candor are the honest. So they value truthfulness above all else. So they're kind of truthful to a fault. They're like lawyers and stuff. Why do they need lawyers? Whatever.
Doesn't matter. Keep going.
Don't ask too many questions.
Don't ask too many questions.
There's Dauntless, who are the brave. They're in control of patrolling the borders of the wall.
They're the police.
And they're police, law enforcement,
But
soldiers.
why do you need that?
Yeah. And then there's erudite, who value intelligence. So they're in charge of science and technological developments and stuff. There's also the factionless, who are basically people who are kicked out of factions, whether they didn't make initiation or they left of their own accord or they're kicked out, whatever. There's lots of reasons why you could become factionless. And they're basically just homeless and they live on the streets.
Well, they're presented as homeless, but I think they do all the manual labor, including some of the farming.
Oh, yeah.
They do all the cleaning. They do all the manufacturing. Because basically you have a society of government officials, lawyers, police, scientists, and farmers.
Yeah.
You need people to do literally everything else. And so the factionless are like the
indentured labor force in a way.
Yeah.
It's not a great system.
So many flaws in the system. Anyways, we start the story and it's from the perspective of Beatrice Pryor. She is 16 and she grew up in Abnegation, and her father is a council member. Her mother does charity work, distributing food to the factionless and stuff like that. And today is her aptitude test, which is like a test you take to determine which faction you actually have an aptitude for. Her brother is also taking it because he's like older than her, but not by a whole year or like a whole school year, basically. So they both take it at the same time.
Huh. I never questioned that.
Don't think about it too hard. But the point is, he is her older brother, and it is intentional in the fact that they are meant to be like choosing their factions at the same time. Because basically, they take their aptitude test. Triss is told that her test results are inconclusive, which means that she is what they call divergent, which they just say is a bad thing and don't talk about it. And she goes home. She's like, this test was supposed to tell me which faction I belong in. And now she doesn't know. She was given an aptitude for Abnegation, Dauntless, and erudite. And she's like, well, my dad hates erudite, so I'm definitely not going to pick that. And then she loves watching the Dauntless, so you can kind of tell that she kind of wants to be one of them. We get to choosing day, and Caleb, her older brother, goes first. She always sees Caleb as being very selfless, so she basically assumes he's probably got abnegation on his test results. He's probably going to choose abnegation. And he chooses erudite. Big shock for everyone. And then Triss is like, oh, sorry, she goes by Triss because when she goes to Dauntless, spoiler alert, sorry, I'm not doing a very good job.
She changes her name from Beatrice to Triss.
Yeah, Triss, short for Beatrice. So Triss goes up and she's like, well, Caleb left, so I should stay with the family. But in her heart, she knows that she doesn't belong in abnegation because she thinks that she's too selfish to be in abnegation, so she chooses Dauntless. And then the rest of the book is her going through the initiation process at Dauntless, which is very brutal and very messed up. But also she falls in love with hot guy, so it's okay.
Hot man.
Tobias
4 fears.
4.
Yeah, he has 4 fears, so he's called 4.
Cool name.
Oh yeah, and then the next kind of like major important point is at the very end, Erudite basically comes up with a serum that turns all of Dauntless into mind-controlled soldiers and sends them to abnegation to kill people so that they can take over. But the simulation doesn't work on Divergent. So Triss, 4, and some other people are able to fight back.
And escape?
And escape. Yeah, they don't save the day because Erudite's still in control, but they're able to escape. They kind of like debate, like, should we link up with Amity and Candor and see who will help us? And that's kind of where it ends. And then they make out on a train in front of Tobias's dad and Caleb.
Now that you say the whole plot out loud, not a lot happens in the middle. Like,
well, the middle is all just Triss's personal stuff, like fighting through initiation. There's like a lot of terrible people, really sad stuff
but
happens.
Like, none of it's really important in the long run.
Well, no. The climax comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
The climax is sort of simmering in the background and then suddenly comes to the fore, and it's very violent and scary all of a sudden. But most of the book is just dedicated to her just trying to become an official member of Dauntless.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the middle of the book is actually like obviously there's like the scary parts where she gets beat up and like kidnapped and like almost killed. But then there's like some fun moments where like she goes zip lining, they play capture the flag.
Paintball.
Yeah, you know, like fun kids stuff. Anyways, I guess we'll just jump right into it and give our general vibes and background context for the book series.
If I could, right before we do that.
Yes.
We have talked about Divergent on this podcast before.
Yes.
And it was not always in a very positive light. But we want to approach the book because it's been a while since we've all read the book.
Yeah.
Right?
This was my first time reading.
This is your first time
This
reading.
is my first
this was
time
Michael's first time reading. Have you seen the movie?
Yes.
Okay. Interesting.
So
I wanted to
familiar
rewatch
with
the
the
movie,
story.
but familiar with the story, but
Yeah.
Okay. Interesting.
It's fun to roast things, but we're taking a step back. We're going to look at it analytically. We're going to look at it from the perspective of like, this is not for our target demographic.
Yes, we are not preteens / teens
anymore.
I am personally going to try not to just take a dump on it the whole time. We're gonna be civil.
Well,
about this.
it's of course easy to poke fun at things.
Yeah.
It's
and
fun to poke fun at
but
things.
we all do it.
I think the main thing for me is like clearly a lot of people like this series.
Oh yeah.
So we don't want to say like, why did you like Divergent when you were 16? But the point of this show is that we're rereading it now that we're much older and just like seeing how we think about it now.
Yeah. And a lot of people also really don't like this series.
Yeah.
But it does bring up a lot of interesting points that I think are worth discussing.
It's filled with ideas, and it allows you to explore those ideas on your own because, at least in the first book, I'm not sure how much it really explores all of the many interesting ideas that it brings up.
Yes. Also, I imagine that we will probably be comparing it to other dystopian novels. We did do a whole episode about the Hunger Games. So some of my commentary is a little bit like, oh, the Hunger Games did this and Divergent did this. But also, again, because I read so many dystopian novels, I might make reference to some of those.
Well, it's a little rough as well because I don't know the behind the scenes info, but a cursory Wikipedia search, which is only the most verifiable of places to get your information, seems to indicate that, Victoria, you said when you were looking stuff up that Veronica Roth wrote this in like a winter intersession, like interterm or something, in her like senior year of college?
Yes. On Wikipedia, it says the novel is Roth's debut novel. and it was published a little over a year after Roth graduated with a bachelor's degree from the creative writing program at Northwestern University. She wrote the novel during her senior year winter break and sold movie rights to the novel before she had graduated. So that's pretty impressive.
When did the movie come out? I feel like it was pretty shortly thereafter, which, taking into account the amount of time between selling the rights of a novel to be made into a movie coming out, even if there's a big push behind it from the studio.
I do think at the time, a lot of authors did sell away movie rights pretty soon after writing a book, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to get made.
Yeah.
No,
so
that's
the movie
true.
came out in 2014, but I think if Divergent had not become such an instant bestseller, perhaps they would not have made that movie.
Okay.
But a lot of authors, I think, to get more of an upfront kind of like paycheck, they would sell the rights to the movie.
That's what Rick Riordan did.
Yeah.
Is that the rights to the movie sold immediately with the book, and that's why he had so little creative control.
Right.
But,
and I understand that. It's more so the fact that it did seem to take off as fast as it did. Even I suppose even if it was the book taking off first, the incredible turnaround of that.
That's true, yeah.
Like
3-year turnaround, because honestly, they would probably start making the movie like in, let's say, 2012. At least like writing the script and like doing all the pre-production
They
stuff.
could have had any number of other novels in the works similarly, and they were waiting to see how the market worked out.
Yeah.
It's wild to think of, especially if this is, I mean, she was in the creative writing program, she writes a book in her winter interterm that you've got to imagine has got to be just like pure creative, like, I'm writing this for me, and that's what it feels like.
It does also say on Wikipedia, though, that she had been working on the series, but from 4's point of view, and then she revisited it a few years later. So it doesn't necessarily give a timeline, but it's kind of implied that she started writing the series maybe as a freshman or before college, and then like once she got through college, like redeveloped the series to be written from Triss's point of view. But still, very impressive.
It sounds like it all just moved very fast.
Yeah.
That all being said, I think it is fair to compare and contrast to the other YA dystopia novels, just because the timeline that is presented to us, and of course there's no way of knowing if she even read any of these other books, the timeline that is presented to us implies that The Hunger Games was out when she started writing the book, or at least was in the process of writing the book. And so any sort of influence that could have happened there is plausible.
Yeah. Well, Hunger Games, I think, would have been out at least a year before.
Yeah,
if
2008.
Not. Okay, well, more than that then.
Hunger Games was 2008. The Maze Runner was 2009.
Interesting.
And then Divergent was 2011.
The big three. The super hulock, if you will.
I do think, I'm trying to think.
Novels.
I think those are kind of quote unquote the big three of YA dystopia.
It feels like it to me.
Hunger Games not launched the genre, but launched the popularity of the genre. The Maze Runner kind of rode that high. And then some say that Divergent killed it. And we're going to talk about that.
I mean, Divergent does have similar vibes. Actually, I feel like it has more similar vibes to the Maze Runner than to the Hunger Games. Because the Maze Runner is also about a weird genetic experiment gone wrong.
I do want to talk about that. But okay,
Yeah.
We've sidetracked a little bit. Victoria, how did you first discover these books, and what was your initial impression as a kid?
Okay, so my background with Divergent is I must have started reading it right around when the books came out, because I remember waiting for at least the third book. I don't remember if I waited for the second one. So around that time, so I was like 13 to 15 years old. So right in the pocket of like the target demographic for being Triss's age and like being in that weird, confusing teenage years time.
Wanting to break out of
wanting
your
to
cloistered
discover
origins.
who I was, and I don't know.
I'm not like the other kids.
Yeah.
I'm divergent.
Yeah. So
Get
I remember.
a tattoo.
Yeah.
Get multiple tattoos.
I remember reading
Climb things.
the books.
Jump on trains. I'm sorry. Keep going.
I remember reading Divergent and Insurgent, the second book, and really liking them. I think also being on Tumblr and the way that Divergent has these factions, it really fed into the fandom culture of like, you get to figure out like what faction you're in. There's like all those quizzes. So I associate Divergent with just that time on the internet where you have like people would write fan fiction where they like, not even fan fiction, but just assigning characters from another franchise to like Divergent factions or whatever. That happened a lot. And then I remember Allegiant, unfortunately, ruined my view of the Divergent series.
Wow. It just even like in isolation for you. Like you read the book and came out of it going, ugh.
What do you mean by in isolation?
Like, so you liked the first two, and then when you read Allegiant before going online, were you like, oh, this has killed my enjoyment of this series?
Yes.
Or was it more in retrospect?
No, I definitely, as soon as I got through the book, I closed it and I was like, that was really bad.
Aw. That's rough.
Sorry. It had the third book curse, which a lot of YA dystopia that I read had a similar kind of trajectory. Where like the first book is pretty good because it sets up the world and the problems. And the second book is pretty decent because it's kind of like fixing some of those problems and then some new problems are introduced. But then usually the third book, I don't know, something about like they feel like they have to wrap it up with like a message for the kids, you know? It kind of sends them into a tailspin where suddenly nothing makes sense anymore. Or because like they already explored a lot of the themes in the second book, then suddenly like the third book has to like do something different.
You've created all these mysteries and questions
Yeah.
that aren't exactly easy to tie up. And then you need to tie them up, but you also don't want to just like explain away things and tuck them away. You want a big climactic ending. And so you end up with this really messy, the scientists did it, something, genetics.
To be fair, I don't remember Allegiant very much. I think I read it and then I was like, that was bad, and I ejected it from my brain. The only thing I remember is that it's the big reveal that the whole city is part of like this big experiment. There apparently was some kind of war. Because you've only watched the first movie. Did you watch the second movie?
I watched the second movie, yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
Did you watch the third movie?
I did not watch third movie part one.
Right. They did a part one and then they never did a part two.
Well, they were going to do like, it was going to be a movie, right? And then it was going to be a TV.
It's going to be a movie, then it was going to be a TV show, and then Shailene Woodley was like, what's going on? And she left, and then it all just fell apart.
Yeah, you can't really make it without her.
I did, both back then and relatively recently, Google, like, what happens in book 3? And it's sort of sparse on details.
Yesterday, I read the summary for Insurgent and Allegiant on Wikipedia, so it's not very detailed, and it was so confusing. Like, it was so nebulous. I would, like, read a sentence and be like, what? I think the biggest problem with Allegiant is it introduces this was all an experiment. There's this other group outside that's been monitoring what's been going on inside the city, and they want there to be divergence.
Okay, interesting.
The factions are the ones who are, like, turning against, because they don't know what's going on. They don't know that being divergent is a good thing. They've been told being in a faction and having one strong dominant trait is the good thing, which is again why this experiment doesn't really make much sense.
Oh, because I knew the whole thing about, it was an experiment. My impression was that the experiment was basically like this sort of shadowy, technocratic group of people who were like, our society died because humans are too unpredictable. We've got it. We'll genetic engineer them. We'll eugenics them into being standard little pegs that can fit into the correct hole.
So technically, that is what happened. There was that experiment, and then they realized that was a bad experiment, so then they had to try and fix it with the faction experiment.
Promoting genetic diversity, but instead of putting up a poster that says, hey, it's okay to marry people from different factions, they instead just said, what if they tried to figure it out themselves and it didn't work? But instead of interfering, they just let it not work.
Well, they did actually interfere.
Oh my gosh.
Sorry, this is
Hold on. I feel like I'm getting multiple things here.
There's a lot of stuff, but there's also a lot of stuff just in the first book of Divergent.
Yeah. We should not get too far ahead of ourselves.
Okay.
I'm just saying, like, that's the problem with Allegiant.
Oh gosh, are we going to read the rest of these?
No. They suddenly introduce all this other stuff that, like, really, like, reframes how you think about the first and second books, but they don't have enough time in the third book to explore all of that.
Huh.
Like, the first book,
well, here's the thing. I'm almost okay with that because the first book doesn't explore a lot either. It offers a lot of ideas, and then it spends most of its time not exploring those ideas and instead just going like...
very quickly bouncing between them. Sometimes in the same sentence,
Yeah.
and sometimes contradicting itself in the same paragraph.
Yes.
So I'm almost okay with just like, Allegiant, just give me all the information. You don't have to make it make sense to me, or like you don't have to weave it into this carefully woven plot where all, these characters are processing everything. It's fine. I don't need that. I've already gotten used to Like, that's not what this book is about. This book is about...
You want like a lore document.
At this point, yeah.
That's fair. That's fair, yeah. Anyways, sorry.
Sorry.
Not to digress. Again, we are just talking about mostly the first book. But again, like, I enjoyed Divergent as a kid. So my purpose when I was rereading it was to, like, think about why I liked it as a kid. I don't know if I came to any conclusions, but it was an interesting way to reread a book.
Did you watch the movies?
I watched the first movie. I remember being upset that they changed a lot of things. I can't say whether they were good changes because I haven't rewatched the movie. I rewatched like the first 15, 20 minutes. And I also watched some clips because I was curious how they did the simulation sequences, which I have some thoughts about. Maybe I'll talk about it later. But I remember I was upset that they changed a lot of things. But I felt that way about a lot of movies when I was a kid. I was that kid who was like, the book was better than the movie.
Well, we were all that kid, I think, at some point.
Which now is interesting because I studied screenwriting in class. So now I understand why they made certain changes. But then I didn't watch the second movie until high school or early college when my friend basically was like, hey, do you want to watch Insurgent just to make fun of it? So I was already at that point.
Yeah.
By the time Insurgent came out, I already didn't care enough about the series to watch it. So that's where I'm at.
Michael, you've seen the movies. You have not read the books.
Until now.
Until now. Movie thoughts? Story thoughts? I guess overarching story thoughts you had before.
It's been long enough that when I think back to the movie and I look at the book, I'm like, yeah, I feel like most of this tracks. I feel like the movie and having to be shorter probably cut out a lot of the time spent just kind of doing the same thing in the book. And, there's certain plot points that, like, of course you have this in the movie. Of course you have just like, all right, we got a little montage of Triss learning how to fight.
Yeah.
We make sure we have the plot point of her mom coming to visit her and telling her to hide the fact that she's divergent. We get the plot point of her going to see the tattoo artist who administered her test, and the tattoo artist, Tori, being like, again, hide the fact that you're divergent. And we get Triss in that sort of memory fearscape with 4. So it's like those plot points stick out in my head. I don't remember excessive detail beyond that. I do remember a scene where the guy who plays Eric holds someone over the pit or whatever, which I don't think was in the book, but it accomplishes the same purpose of just letting us know that, like, oh, he's a bad guy.
Yeah.
Also, as I remember, the guy who plays Eric in the movie, I think is kind of a character actor in terms of playing, like, the second in command, like, antagonist muscle.
Their cast was pretty stacked, I will say.
And he played it well. And I think I liked him a little more in the movie because I could take him a little more seriously, at least in comparison to most of the character of Eric in the book.
If I recall, the movie, I think, improves on the book just because it's able to do movie structure.
Yeah.
And so you don't have this sort of like meandering, sort of bouncing between themes, a lot of internal monologue that's not saying very much.
Yeah. Again, what? She wrote it for herself, it seems.
Yeah,
she was letting
okay.
her creativity run wild, and maybe it could have benefited from some additional rewrites, or who knows. I would challenge any of us at the age of 22 to do much better.
Yeah. I could not.
I don't think I could have either.
One thing I will say about the movie, because I did watch the first 15, 20 minutes this morning, it had a great soundtrack.
Oh.
Yeah. They used Run Boy Run by Woodkid
amazing.
when Triss first runs with the Dauntless and jumps on the train.
That's cool.
And I was like, this is pretty good. It's a good song.
Yeah,
I
Wicked.
was trying to think if there were like songs that I associated with Divergent, but I think I'll have to rewatch the movie to like get a better handle on that. But maybe I'll talk about it in the recap. I think Hans Zimmer did the score too.
Whoa, really?
Yeah.
Remote Control Productions.
Divergent was composed by Junkie XL with Hans Zimmer. So 2 very, very impressive composers.
Yeah,
who've
and
done a lot
it
of good
featured
stuff.
Ellie Goulding a lot.
Ah, Ellie Goulding.
Yes.
Yeah.
She was having her moment.
What about you, Jino?
I think I've already talked about this, so I'll give like the Spark Notes version. I saw the movie, liked the movie, it was fun, okay. Read the book, really, really liked the book until the last, must have been like 3 or 4 chapters. I said like last 2 chapters, but like the last, like the climax, I read the climax and I was like, this sucks.
Oh,
And then I picked up Insurgent and I read the first few chapters and I was like, this is continuing to suck. And I put it down in a fit of rage. I remember the exact moment I put Insurgent down because it was the first time I'd ever put down a book out of anger and refused to keep reading it.
Whoa.
And so I did not finish Insurgent, did not read Allegiant. And my disdain for the series grew slowly over the years as I kept reading other stories that hit on similar themes, and also fell back in love with the Hunger Games, which does it so much. It does it in its own way, and it's good.
I just think the Hunger Games is so much more intentional, but it's also talking about way different things than Divergent is. That's why I think Divergent is maybe a little bit more similar to the Maze Runner.
It is more similar
than
to the
Hunger Games. But because it got swept in the wave, a lot of people compare Divergent and the Hunger Games. Female protagonists, kind of similar, coming of age story. I don't know. I think it's all fascinating.
Revolutionize the society.
Yeah.
It makes me, because I did recently read The Maze Runner again, it makes me appreciate The Maze Runner more. The Maze Runner is an incredibly flawed book and a very flawed series. I would say it does the sort of thing that you described, the third book problem, where the first book is very interesting and it uses a lot of mystery and questions. And then when you start answering those questions, it all kind of falls apart. But it does make me appreciate The Maze Runner better, because the Maze Runner gets to their weird, the scientist did it much faster, and then spends a lot more time thinking about that.
Yeah.
Whereas Divergent kind of puts it off and puts it off and puts it off. And by the time you get to it, it's too late and there's too much. But yeah, that's my Divergent thoughts.
Can I ask, what was it, if you recall, about the climax that made you go, no, not this?
It was a few things. And reading back, I think helped me process that a little bit more. Triss's relationship with Four, I personally have a lot of problems with, but I think it comes to a head at that climax when, spoiler alert, hey, most of her family dies, and Four's basically like, hey, that sucks. I love you.
Yeah.
And Triss is like, oh, wow.
It's nice to kiss.
And me as a kid goes, huh? What? You just saw both of your parents get shot in front of your eyes.
Yeah.
And your final thought is, I am so brave. What? Shut up. And then they get to Amity or whatever, and I was just done. I was so done.
That's
also
interesting, because so much of the book's time is spent on Triss and Four. I mean, a lot of it's time spent on Triss just being I'm learning how to be Dauntless.
Yeah.
So
Triss's character is a lot of people describe her as bland or not really a character. I disagree. I think she has a lot of character. I just think it's very unstable. She doesn't really have an arc or a progression, and her character, if you graphed it, would go up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down, up, down.
It's almost like she is Divergent. It's almost like she's human.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it sort of comes to a head in the climax when she makes decisions and feels feelings that are immediately discounted by her next decision and feeling. There's a moment where she decides I'm not going to kill people. I'm really glad I didn't kill Peter. Bang, 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 bang. I love killing people. Oh no, they're killing people. Bang, 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 bang. I love killing people. It's and you kind of get it. She's a kid in a very violent situation, and there's a lot happening. But as a reader, it makes me care about the character less because it seems like she's making and feeling things randomly.
Which, in a situation like that, as you pointed out, could be true.
Could be true.
But perhaps the book needs to hang a lantern on that a little more. The fact that she's I make a decision that feels totally solid 1 minute, and then the next minute, I have mind-controlled people shooting at me, and all of my ethics go out the window.
Yeah. But it's sort of as a climax, and not just the climax of the story, but as the peak of a character arc.
Yeah.
You want your character to finally make a stand. You know? This is what I, as a character, am going to become as a character. And she doesn't really do that. She just does her best to stop the thing, kind of succeeds, and then gets with the guy.
And then runs away.
And runs away. And to me as a kid, that was not a satisfying conclusion. Yeah. And I found it really frustrating that it seemed to just throw away all these other characters. Just killing a bunch of people just randomly, it felt like.
Yeah. I don't know how you all feel. I'd like to ask the both of you. Who are the most interesting characters, or who, whether it's one character or multiple characters, for you? Because I have my own answer.
Uriah, 100%.
Uriah.
He's the Dauntless-born initiate that sort of befriends Triss.
Right.
Him and his group of friends are the only characters who talk like real people. It was the only scene where I was like, this is really good writing. Maybe that was a little too harsh.
Well,
it was one of the only scenes where I was impressed, where the writing really stood out to me.
It felt more natural to you.
It felt like a bunch of kids goofing off and being kids.
Yeah. It helps because Triss is also kind of locking in on this is what being Dauntless should be about. About community and freedom and not like beating people up for the sake of beating them up. And I think you feel that in the writing.
Yeah. The rest of the characters kind of felt either too stiff or too flippy-floppy in their motivations or their descriptions, I guess. I don't know. Will's nice. Too bad she shot him.
I just personally want to say, in terms of characters, there's a lot of characters in Divergent.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of my major problems with it is some of the characters just kind of wash into the background and then suddenly they'll come up and you'll be like, who is that again? And I have to like literally like flip back and be like, okay, that person was from Erudite and they're important for this reason or whatever. Which like compared to the Hunger Games where there's a lot of characters, but each of them feels distinct and important. Like they either have like a specific skill that you know them for, even though in the Hunger Games, sometimes you don't even know their names. Sometimes it's just boy from District 4, which I guess in a way does signal to you who that person is. I don't know. I just remember like not being as confused in the Hunger Games as I was in Divergent when there's just like so many names thrown at you. Because like honestly, I couldn't even remember who the Dauntless born initiates were versus the non-Dauntless born. Like I knew Will and Christina and Al because they're Triss's good friends. But like I was like Peter, Drew, and Molly. I was like, I think who are they again? Like it took me a couple times to figure out who they were.
Yeah.
I don't know if I have a favorite character, to be honest.
No, Uriah's like that. When he appeared back in the story, when he was like, hey, I'm hanging out with my cool friends. I'm like, who is this guy?
Yeah.
Where'd he come from? I liked him when he was there, but I didn't know where he came from.
I agree. I wouldn't say he's my favorite character, but I think Al's character is maybe the most interesting. I just feel really bad for him, though.
A really curious, like, case study.
Yeah.
At first I thought, because I knew there was going to be a mind control plot at some point. At first I thought he was, like, being, like, early experimented on, or he was, like, extra susceptible to, like, the weird simulation stuff, and it was, like, literally starting to take over his mind. But after finishing reading, I feel like his plot is literally just about how the redefined version of the Dauntless faction just drives certain kinds of people to the point of, like, madness, and then eventually opting out, so to speak.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is interesting, I suppose, as an exploration of that faction, but also kind of like negatively colors any kind of positive. I don't know. It's like when that happens and it's like, okay, clearly this thing is messed up. And we've been talking about how messed up Dauntless has become. It sort of makes it difficult for me to then celebrate Triss when she like succeeds at the initiation. I'm like, okay, but Triss, we've been in your head. You can recognize, and you've told us how apparently Dauntless has changed even though you didn't see the way it was, and now how you see that things are like kind of awful here, and how it's seemingly directly resulted in like a great deal of tragedy, even to like just not everyone necessarily, but you can see things going wrong. And yet you're like very happy to be embraced by this at the end.
Yeah.
Which, hey, as a character, that can be fine. You know, like this is part of a story.
But as a reader,
it makes you go like, well, hold on a second.
Because Dauntless is a bad place to be, run by bad people. And Triss's constant reckoning with that, like, oh, these are bad people. I really, really, really want to be here. I love being Dauntless. I'm surrounded by monsters, and they're constantly traumatizing me. What a great time. As a reader, it kind of drives you nuts. You're like, get out of there. Shouldn't this be a story about getting out of there?
Yeah, well, it's like, that can still be interesting, but the story doesn't want to tell you that story. The story wants to tell you, at least up until the climax, the story of like, I'm figuring out where I belong, and I belong here. And then at the end, it's like, oh, surprise, I belong nowhere because I am divergent. It's like, you were told you were divergent at the beginning of the story. This isn't new information.
We're told repeatedly once about every 5 chapters in a little tiny paragraph, and we're like, why is that important? And they're like, shh. We can't tell you why it's important. Shh, just remember, it's the name of the book. Shh.
It's like you were given medical test results telling you that you have X, and for the entire book you're going, but maybe I actually don't. And it's like, well, you've been told this by multiple people across the entire book.
That would be a crazy twist, though. Can you imagine, like, last chapter, they're like, oh, Triss, you're not divergent. It's like, the name of the book is the joke.
At this point, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know.
Well, here's the thing about Triss, because people were talking about like, oh, she's bland. And I kind of get that. Here's the thing. First chapter, for me, I was locked in.
Mm.
I was actually really into it. And it partly was because of the blandness of Triss's perspective. The fact that all of this weird stuff is happening as all these factions converge on this hub, and they all enter in different ways, and they're all wearing different clothes, and they're all acting a very particular way in accordance with their it's an absurd situation. And to have the perspective you're experiencing it from just feed it to you as like raw information without too much color is interesting, because it makes you go like, Victoria's like trying to hold in a laugh. But it was interesting to me because it leads, like, I could tell Veronica Roth knew it was going somewhere. Like, Triss has this feeling of anticipation. We are clearly going to an event that the author knows what it is, and the character we're experiencing it from clearly has an expectation. And so it was this very interesting introduction. And then for the rest of the book, it was like that exact same level of, like, just kind of passively taking things in, or feeling whatever feelings Triss was feeling at any given time without too much self-analysis, it felt like. And the things that Triss experiences and the way she puts them to the reader makes her feel to me less like perhaps a kind of messianic chosen one, like a Divergent, and more like a warlord in the making.
Like, this is the evil, tragic backstory to make the supervillain of the next book.
Well, there's certain things Triss will say or do or observe that feel to me like, maybe you do belong in Dauntless.
There's a lot of like, I'm glad he's hurt.
Yeah.
I'm glad he's in pain. I'm glad he's dead. I'm like, all right, Triss.
And there's
Go get him.
There's a few lines here that I actually wrote down, and my mom and sister watched the first movie and liked it, and I remember seeing the second movie with them because they're like, oh, okay, cool. So I was talking to my mom a little bit about the differences between the movie experience from what I could remember and the book experience. And I was just like, I'm going to read you some lines that come from Triss's inner monologue.
Okay.
And I wrote down, Triss is really catty.
Okay.
But after finishing the book, it feels less like cattiness, which is on me, and more like, no, she's just ruthless. And that ruthlessness starts in a very quiet sort of social place and then becomes violence. So, okay, here's one quote. He bursts into laughter at his joke, and Molly and Drew join in. Molly has an ugly laugh, all snorting and shaking shoulders, and Drew's is silent, so it almost looks like he's in pain. And I'm like, okay, not too intense.
I will say, Triss is really hypercritical of other people's appearances.
Yes,
Yeah.
Which is where...
And her own.
That's true.
And her own. She
but-
constantly talks about, especially in later chapters, how she's upset that she has a child's body.
Oh, we ought to touch on that, but not right now. But we're going to touch on that because
It was more so like the fact that we have a very normal line. If he bursts into laughter at his own joke, Molly and Drew join in. And then it goes to, Molly has an ugly laugh. Like, I can see the head shake a little bit.
Molly has an ugly laugh, and it's bad and gross for my eyes.
Okay, next quote. Even though I am still injured, I had to fight again today. Luckily, this time I was paired against Myra, who couldn't throw a good punch if someone was controlling her arm for her. I got a good hit in during the first 2 minutes. She fell down and was too dizzy to get back up. I should feel triumphant, but there is no triumph in punching a girl like Myra.
She hates weakness.
She hates weakness.
Despises it. She loathes it from the moment we meet her.
Yeah.
And it makes her very unlikable.
And like, here's the thing. I read that quote to my mom, like, that's pretty intense. And my mom gave a very good point. She was like, well, she could be saying that there's no triumph in beating up someone that she feels like can't really defend themselves, even in a sparring match. And I'm like, that's true. However, there is another quote that isn't, I believe, directly about Myra. It's about someone Triss actively doesn't like. So it comes at a different point. But it still reads, she touches her chin. If her chin was bigger, it might balance out her nose, but it is weak and almost recedes into her neck. And at that point, my mom was like, okay. And me too. I'm like, what? And that's kind of how she processes everything. Whether or not it's critical, it's like very material and abrasive. Like later on in the climax, another inner monologue, I look over my shoulder at the ground. If I fall now, I will die. But I don't think I will fall. And I'm like, okay, Conan the Barbarian, like, that might have been actually earlier in the book. But it's very much like, I can feel the tunnel vision closing in around me. I can see this person who has this capacity for extreme executive action and a despisal of weakness and a, like, desire to, like, carve a path through whatever she wants, and I can see literally the character she will become in the form of the person who will destroy this faction system and not necessarily leave it in a place that is like a better one. She's just going to break the thing.
Yeah.
She sounds like a Sith.
She sounds like a Sith. And you know what? Kind of weird how much that works out, I think. I don't know if it's intentional.
I think that would be a cool third book if she became like a villain. That would be cool.
Because I don't know enough about the third book even to know whether or not she finds a quote-unquote better way.
Victoria, I feel like you've been sort of holding back your thoughts. Your facial expressions have been like all over the place.
I'm so amused.
I want to hear what you think.
I am sorry. There's so much. There's many ideas in here.
There's a lot.
I'm kind of like chewing on what you're saying, Michael, because I don't think I picked up on that as much, besides me being like, wow, Triss like is very hypercritical of other people's appearances to a somewhat concerning degree sometimes. I noted when she meets Janine Matthews for the first time, she tears her apart for having like stretch marks on her knees.
Yeah.
And like a little bit of a stomach. And I was like, that's crazy. Like, I don't know if it's like
She
more
doesn't,
so like Triss's character, or
Yeah.
this is where I'm like, is this just part of Triss's character? Like you noted, where like she just takes note of people's physical appearances and notes like signs of weakness, or is it more about like Veronica Roth's point of view?
That's like the
It's kind of
treacherous
dicey.
territory.
Yeah. Like I don't want to say like, oh, Veronica Roth is conveying bad messages about people's bodies or whatever, but I don't know. I was just like, it gave me a little bit of the feeling of like, oh, Janine is evil, so it's okay to like
tear
her apart for like small physical imperfection. I don't know. It was so weird to me.
Because it's interesting. She doesn't say she has stretch marks on her knee and they're gross. She just acknowledges, like, of all the things she could acknowledge,
I think
she acknowledges
for me,
the stretch marks
it's
on her knee.
because, it is just simply because she acknowledges it, it's highlighted as a negative thing.
Yeah.
Because she'll say, like, Janine is wearing a body-fitting dress from, like, her neck to her knees, and it highlights her stomach. And I was like, okay, that's weird. I don't know. Okay.
It's so
Part
much in
of it-
phrasing.
I do think it is probably, I mean, this is a generalization.
Of course.
It is probably similar to how a lot of teenage girls just navigate the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. There is like a certain layer of that context in the way that Triss is written where, I don't know.
I feel like you're partially right, but also other authors that do a similar thing where they equate ugliness to badness, or they assume negative physical traits and then they place those on characters you're not supposed to like. In a vacuum, that's sort of like, oh yeah, it's just using like immersive stories or whatever. But like once you start picking up a pattern, you can start to realize that no, this is not like a characterization or like a creative choice. This is like this is what the author thinks about the world, and it's sort of like leaking into the story.
Yeah.
And there are some popular authors that do that. And like in retrospect, like now we know more about them. Like, oh, like this is, you really do think this about people.
Mm-hmm.
And the way Divergent's written, it kind of makes me think that maybe that's a little bit unintentional, just like leaking into the story a little bit.
Yeah.
Because it happens over and over and over again, and it feels vindictive.
At the beginning, I thought this was just a symptom of this is how you convey someone's physical appearance to the reader. Because it's a book, you can't see the characters, you don't know what they look like, and the only way you can get it is through the main character's point of view. And of course, the main character's personal biases or whatnot are going to affect the way that they see that person. So it's kind of like, okay, maybe it is just part of building Triss's character. Addressing, because I don't want to spend too much time on this, but going back to what Jino said about how Triss feels like very like indecisive and wishy-washy.
I wouldn't say indecisive. She as a character isn't indecisive. It's just the way she's written. It feels like the author is indecisive about how she should be. But the character is not confused about what she should do.
She is a little bit, though, because the main thing she's wrestling with is, I was born in abnegation. So these are all the values and traits that I have that I was raised in for 16 years of my life. I've only been in Dauntless for like less than a year. Triss doesn't realize how much abnegation still affects her despite the fact that she's chosen Dauntless. And divergence aside, I think she just feels conflicted about like, am I actually who I choose to be, or am I just a product of the place I grew up in? I think I'm personally maybe just a little bit more forgiving of the fact that she doesn't really have as much of an arc in the first book. A, because I think Veronica Roth was going for more of like a 3-book character arc for her, and B, because she is a 16-year-old girl. I think I was just kind of like, yeah, that time was, it's just weird to be a 16-year-old and to be asked to choose what you're going to do for the rest of your life based on like an aptitude test, which by the way, the aptitude test doesn't make sense world building wise.
No.
But I think they kind of explain it because like Janine's the one who created it. And I think Janine's purpose was not to like help society. It was literally just to weed out divergence. So
yeah, the aptitude test isn't necessary for any of the ceremonial parts of it.
It's weird to me because we are introduced to the world. It's like, okay, here are all the factions. Each faction values different things. So you're like, okay, great. Then Triss says, but today we're taking an aptitude test, which will determine which faction we actually belong in. And you're like, okay. But then you get to the test and everyone already has internalized biases based on where you grew up. So even though Triss is taking an aptitude test that's supposed to tell her maybe you belong in a different faction, because clearly that's part of their society. It's a natural thing for people to go to other factions. At the same time, if you join another faction, you're ostracized from your family and it's seen as a deep betrayal. And people already have preconceived notions about you even before you take your aptitude test. So like the minute she walks into a room, Tori is like, what's with you abnegation and mirrors or whatever?
Yeah.
She's already like, I see you, you're wearing abnegation clothes, so you must be abnegation, even though she's literally meant to be taking a test that could tell her she's not abnegation. It's just like a weird context for me.
Yeah, and then also, they're not supposed to talk about the test results, and the test results don't matter because they just choose their own faction anyway.
Yeah.
Which, if you were like, I know I do belong to this faction, see my test results or something, or like, oh, I don't want to show people, but like they don't have a choice in that.
I think it could hypothetically work in the sense of you've been brought up in a certain society, you have been nurtured to perhaps be a certain way, but your nature may be different. And depending on how much of a sway that has over you and your capacity to get along with people and feel at home in yourself, you know, maybe there's more impact that your nature has on you versus how you've been raised. That could influence perhaps your desire to live in one faction or another. And the aptitude test could perhaps provide clarity for any inner conflict that you've had. At the same time, it is kind of messy, and knowing that it comes from not an interest in trying to sort people, but just to weed out divergence.
Which is why I was like, as I was reading further, I was like, okay, maybe I shouldn't be as critical of the aptitude test because maybe it was meant to be that when you read it, you think this is inherently flawed because it is.
Yeah.
I think the original experiment was meant to be like, we separate people into factions, but then we encourage them to change factions because that's how you create divergence. You start out in your faction that you're raised in, and then you go to a different one where there's different philosophies and different ways of life. And that's how you learn to become your own person as an amalgamation of all these different experiences that you've had. But because it was a poorly designed experiment, I guess, it just turned into like, no, you should just stick to your own faction. And if you change factions, it's seen as a bad thing. I don't know. I guess that's where like society comes in, and it's like, is it more of a reflection on the society or on the people who designed it? I don't know.
I enjoyed reading about this sort of aptitude test and the serums, and also just the way the people in the factions acted and the sort of like almost nonsensical way they would act. I enjoyed reading about that more if I took it from the perspective of not a capital E like Allegiant experiment, but just like a general like lowercase e science experiment of like, there's a reason why all these people are acting slightly brainwashed and doing things that don't quite make sense for their society if this is a science experiment. And in that case, I think it's actually really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the science experiment they eventually ended up with to explain it doesn't quite work. But just reading Divergent, at least the first few chapters, as like as an outside observer, I found that really enjoyable.
I do think Divergent at its core concept is really interesting. And I think that's why so many people latched onto it and found it interesting. And it does have like a lot of room for exploration, I feel, in terms of like, if you just even think about how it's someone from Amity doing Dauntless. We don't actually get to see that because none of the new initiates are from Amity. But it would be interesting to be like, oh, you grew up in a place that prioritizes kindness over whatever Dauntless has become. It's
Violence.
It's very interesting. There's a lot of room to explore, not only from sort of a science perspective, but also like an ethics perspective too.
And I do wish it explored those things, but it doesn't really explore those things at all. Maybe a little bit.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's ultimately why Divergent was disappointing to me as a kid, was because I felt like there were so many interesting things it could explore, but then ultimately it ended up kind of falling short of that.
I don't know if we want to get too much into it, but there's a lot of very interesting takes on politics and sociology and society and just human nature that are just kind of like dropped on and then left.
Yeah, I do think Veronica Roth has interesting things to say. It's just that the way that they're conveyed is kind of weird. Like, sorry, I'm kind of jumping all over the place.
You're good.
But there was
So does the book.
Yeah. There was one moment where finally I was like, oh, Four is saying something really interesting. And then the very next line, Triss is like, Four has really great muscles. It's just like, okay, I get it. You're a teenage girl. But sorry, to compare to the Hunger Games again, like in Hunger Games, the romance plotline is very closely linked with the overall message of the story. I think the problem with Divergent is it tries to do that in the sense where like Four, in order to overcome his fears, needs Triss's assistance or like Triss's perspective to help him overcome those fears, or at least like she doesn't solve his fear for him. He's clearly still afraid of like his dad and like heights and all that stuff, but it's easier because she's there. And I think that's a pretty good exploration. But so many times, like Triss's relationship with Four or her feelings for Four just kind of like get in the way of like the message that Veronica Roth is trying to tell. And so in that case, I think it makes her feel a little bit more annoying because you're just like, we're finally getting to like the good stuff. And then you're just over here being like, but does Four really like me?
Yeah.
Like,
Well, here's the thing, at least in my read, in my perspective, that's what is intended to be the good stuff. I personally think Divergent is a love story first and whatever the hell else it is second.
yeah, okay,
That's what it feels like to me too.
the interesting thing, because I was talking about this other series I read called Matched,
Yeah.
where basically it's kind of a similar premise where you turn 18 and then you go and then you like take this test, or I don't even know if it's a test in that book. I think you just go in a room and they'll be like, based on your genetics and your interests and stuff, we've matched you with your perfect partner, and that's your partner for life. But then in the
Based on
book,
the results of your online Divergent faction quiz.
You've
It's
matched with Gerald from Wisconsin. Congratulations.
yeah, that's one where it's like definitely romance is both the plot and the subplot and like the whole point of the whole entire. Like, I think that's the progression where it's like Hunger Games is mainly a story about revolution with a romance
And
subplot.
the romance enhances the revolution.
Yes. And then it slowly inched along the spectrum, and then it got to Divergent, which is like maybe a little half and half, where it's like half love story, half other stuff. And then we get to Matched, where it's just, yeah, the kids just want to see people fall in love and messy love triangles and stuff. So let's give them that. And then we'll just give them a little bit of social commentary on top.
Yeah.
Turns out it's just the progression of, I don't know what progression, but that feels like we've worked our way back to like soap opera or something.
Yeah, I mean,
Which
I
is
think,
fine. That's not a derogatory thing. That's just, it's a funny observation where it's like, in the end, we all become old and
People
tied
love
to our
romance.
chairs.
I love romance.
Yeah.
But this is not a good romance. Sorry.
Obviously, there's a time and a place, and when you're a teenager, you don't care so much about all this other stuff. You're just like, what's the most compelling? Okay, the relationship between these two characters is the most compelling, so I want to read more about that. But I don't know.
Do we want to talk about Four and Triss? Can I talk about Four and Triss?
Let's talk about Four and Triss.
Four and his four fears.
Hold on. Ship names, were they called Fortress?
Yeah.
Fortress.
I'm-
Friss. Tor.
I'm
No, I'm
glad
pretty
they
sure it
were
was just
called
Fortress.
Fortress because it is a great ship name. However, there's a sinister little part of me that wishes they had gone with something a lot less intuitive and like clean and gone with something like Triss 4 or Friss. Or
What's his name? Tobias?
Tobias.
So it would just be Tobias?
Tobias.
Tobias? Be bias, because Beatrice?
Oh.
Be bias.
Tobeatrice?
Tobeatrice? Toby. Toby.
We can't do this again.
Victoria's like, stop it. Okay, 4 and Triss. Their whole draw is that 4's older. 4 is
By
her,
2 years.
By 2 years. 4 is her instructor. And Triss is, as we were told repeatedly, many, many times by both her, her enemies, and her friends, a little girl who looks like a tiny, tiny baby child. And 4 is a big, big boy. He's a big, strong man. I hate it. I hate it.
No, this is where it becomes like, no, this is a romance book, and this is, I think, about the, like, I don't know, the trope and or fantasy of, like, maybe you're like, you feel insecure, like, I'm not seen as desirable, but the most desirable person around here thinks I'm desirable.
It is definitely grounded in the
romance trope category of
I'm so
plain.
Yeah, I don't think I'm very pretty or beautiful. I'm not like a model. I'm just a girl. And yet this guy really who is very capable or like more attractive than I feel like I'm out of his league, but he likes me.
Or no, he's out of my league.
Right. Yeah. Sorry. I don't know what to say.
something.
Yeah. You know what I mean? But
it's a
my
fantasy.
plainness cannot be matched.
Yeah. But like.
It's a fantasy. Right?
But
because it's a fantasy, it doesn't work as 2 characters having a real connection and relationship. And it never
I think
fixes
it
itself.
can work. I think
it could work.
It could work.
If you because the
Jino
problem,
and I have our fingers in the air.
The problem is not just people debate age all the time. Let's just like throw that away really quick. Like the legality of it, whatever. He's an adult.
Yeah.
The power dynamic. He is her instructor, and literally her life is in his hands. Like her literal life.
Yeah.
Because we see Eric throw people off cliffs or whatever, right? He has the same level of power. And so the idea is that in a perfect world, in a perfect scenario, she's able to match his level of authority and power, and then they find common ground. And then through that, they're able to build a relationship of trust, right? I don't think that happens. In my opinion, 4 is always over her. And even though becomes very vulnerable with her, and they quote unquote find equal ground, he always has power over her up to the very last moment.
Yeah.
Either through his position or through the plot. And it makes that last scene in the train where she's like, my parents are dead. He's like, but I'm hot. Disgusting to me.
Well, that scene in particular is like, I don't know why whatever. As for the rest of it, it's the romance trope. That's all I got for it. It's like there are so many romance books that are unbelievably problematic. But that's not the point. You don't go to them to get the healthy dynamic. You go to them to scratch an itch. And to feed a kind of like, in the realm of fantasy, this is okay because the moment I'm not okay with it, I can put the book down.
This is not my itch. This is a lot of other people's itch.
And
this
that's
is not my itch.
But, not for everyone.
Yeah, I did go into it where I was like, I should try and critique this romantic subplot. And I have nothing to say about it besides that I just don't really get it. It's not really for me. Why are you making out in front of your boyfriend's dad and your brother after just killing a bunch of people and then your parents? Whatever. I can't roll my eyes hard.
Well, as we know for Triss, she really likes violence and taking out the weak.
Yeah.
Except when she doesn't.
I think the most compelling parts of their relationship are maybe the fear landscape part where he like finally like shows her like these are the things I'm afraid of. But even the lead up to it felt so random. It took me a minute to like actually like get into the scene because I was just like, wait, so she like just walks into the area and he's like, oh, you happen to be here. I happen to be doing this. Let's do it together.
Well, he was like, I hoped you would follow me. It's one of those things where it's like the lead up to this scene could have used more work, but that's not the point. The point is that we are in the little
that's
fear
true.
landscape.
Like so many romance tropes like this are just like, it doesn't matter how they got here. The important thing is that we're here. Yeah.
Jino, you mentioned a number of days ago that there are aspects of reading this book that feel similar to fan fiction.
Yes, I think fan fiction is a very important and necessary part of culture, and I think it is real writing, and I think it's good, and I like reading fan fiction.
Yes.
This book is like bad fan fiction.
Well, you brought up an interesting point. You said like there's like details that it'll give us a lot of in ways that fan fiction will provide a lot of details on certain things, and then skip over details where it's like you're not here for this.
Yeah, I'll try my best to summarize. When you're reading a piece of fan fiction, let's say you're reading, I don't know, Captain America x Tony Stark fan fiction. You know who these characters are. You know what Tony's like. You know what Steve's like. The story doesn't need to introduce you to them or the world. The story does not need to justify why they're in this scenario, because you as a reader are going in looking for one specific thing, which is their relationship. That's all you care about. And so the writer realizes this. The writer doesn't need to explain or justify anything. That's what Divergent's like. Divergent is a series of scenes that don't really justify themselves, at least the romantic part, that don't really justify themselves, that just want to get to the good stuff as fast as possible. And so it feels like fan fiction, not in a way that fan fiction is bad, but that its writing feels like it's referencing something that doesn't exist. It's asking you to know things about the world and the characters that you can't possibly know, and it's asking you to accept writing choices that would be totally fine if you did already know those things, or if you were going into the story expecting those things.
I think similarly, in fan fiction, if you're reading like a certain ship, you already like those characters and you understand their dynamic and you want them to be together. If in Divergent, you don't understand why Four and Triss have this connection, all of it is out of the water.
Yeah.
She doesn't spend a whole lot of time on the reasons why they like each other. It's just kind of like this almost unspoken thing.
Oh,
which
it's so
again,
unspoken. They don't speak a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot of like, she's always just like his eyes or whatever, which I think you can get away with a little bit more in fan fiction because again, you already kind of have an idea of why these characters are drawn to each other. But in Divergent, unless you yourself are also like, yes, I am into Four, you probably don't understand why Four and Triss, or like why Triss likes Four that much.
Yeah.
You're just kind of like, okay, he's an attractive guy.
Maybe because he has that abnegation quality, because he is actually Tobias. Which is a good segue to talking about some interesting sub-themes with religion in this. We don't have to get too detailed.
Yes.
But it's very interesting that there is a very close connection between abnegation and being like pious, specifically to what seems to be
abnegation qualities are
God.
Crazy. Can I just, sidebar.
That's fine.
Going back to how you said like Triss just like delivers information very like point blank.
Yeah.
There's so many times where like you think you understand what being abnegation is and suddenly she'll throw another thing that's like not allowed or like you're not allowed to be if you're abnegation. Like you're not allowed to be curious if you're abnegation.
It's...
What does that have to do
Victoria,
with selflessness?
it's a gateway to gossip.
I guess. But it's like she's talking about, I think it was like about being curious about like the Dauntless compound or something.
You're just supposed to accept everything as it is and not seek change.
But what does that have to do with selflessness?
I don't know. I don't know. I'm not Veronica Roth.
Another thing she says is that killing yourself is an act of selfishness because you thought about yourself so long that you didn't want to live, which is very problematic in my opinion.
Well, you know, it's, it's one of those hot takes, let's call it, that seems quite aligned with a different sort of opinionated belief system. Again, there's a lot of interesting connections there.
Yeah.
And what's especially interesting to me is that Triss leaves that. She's like, I don't belong here.
Yeah, okay, so that's where
like from the beginning, she's like, I feel too selfish for these people. I don't want to give up my seat to someone else. I don't want to take into account someone else's feelings. I want to run on a moving train.
Yeah.
I want to punch and kick.
And normally, I think that your instinct would be like, okay, so because Triss wants all these quote unquote selfish things, the message is going to be that it's worse when she leaves that life. If it's meant to be a message about like, well, you should be selfless and like, these are good qualities. But being dauntless is portrayed as being a very good thing. She talks about
At
how...
least like original OG Dauntless.
Yeah.
Constitutionalist Dauntless.
Our founding fathers Dauntless.
Yeah. That's where the messaging gets kind of murky, but also kind of interesting to me.
The whole like bravery is selflessness.
I did like that. I did like that a lot,
Yeah.
where when 4 says you are bravest when you are selfless, I think that's like a pretty good message, I would say. I think the most interesting thing to me is that leaving abnegation is basically like leaving a life of repression, because they're so repressed in abnegation.
Yeah.
It got to the point where I was like, obviously people are leaving because you are not allowed to be curious.
You're not allowed to look at yourself? What if you have...
What if you're like so yoked though?
Yeah.
What if you've been working out? You got to admire your gains.
Yeah, I just think like of all the factions, abnegation kind of goes the furthest into negative, but like weirdly negative things. Like
Self-flagellating, let's call it.
Okay, like candor, I get it, because it's like you want to be truthful, but if you're too truthful, then you'll end up
hurting people
or being too blunt and like people don't want to talk to you. Abnegation, it's like, okay, you have to be so selfless that you only ever think about other people. You never even for a second think about yourself. You can't look at yourself in the mirror. You can't think about what you want to do with your life. Like even the simple fact of Triss going to the aptitude test and deciding what she wants to do for the rest of her life is seen as selfish because she's not allowed to think about herself at all. But it's so unrealistic. And also, how do they control that? Because at least like in Candor, they have truth serums that force you to tell the truth. In Abnegation, like who's watching to make sure you're not looking at yourself in the mirror
I think
too
it's just
much?
societal pressure.
Which is the thing, because it feels like, it feels like this is the privileged perspective of perhaps, now I'm venturing into treacherous territory, because this feels like some of the most intense stories that I've heard of extremely, let's call it non-denominationally repressive sub-communities.
Yes.
That's kind of the theme to me, though, right? Like, yes, you can't constrain, the human spirit. You know, it's going to be a mix of things, and that's the whole point of this. But it's interesting that Triss has to get out of there because she can't just be just that one thing or exist in that one thing. Dauntless is also a little too much. In my opinion, I think she's being traumatized from the moment she gets there, and she doesn't know what she wants.
Constantly traumatized.
But
they love it.
There's an interesting, and I think the book leans into this intentionally. When she's there, she is constantly leaning back into and finding security and comfort in things that remind her of abnegation. And that is in Tobias, in the sense that she just, I guess, picks up a vibe off him.
Yeah.
The food.
She gets peas and chicken and some other thing.
Brown
Beans,
bread.
I think. Oh, yeah, brown bread.
Lots of mention of peas in this
so
book.
many mentions of peas.
Maybe Chicago loves peas.
And the Chicago bean is
The Chicago bean. The Chicago
It was like 1 a.m. and I was reading the book and I was like, wait, this is describing the Chicago bean. I've never even seen the Chicago bean, but I know she's describing the Chicago bean. Sorry.
We love the
Sorry,
Chicago
continue,
bean.
Michael. Your point was very on point.
I don't know. It's just like, even when she blacks out because she gets attacked and almost killed or something by her other trainees. And then she wakes up in Four's room and she sees, like, the first thing she sees is a poster that Four has that says, what is it exactly?
Fear nothing but God or something like that?
Yeah, fear nothing but God, which I feel like for that character makes sense to me, both from the culture that Tobias came from, as well as how much of a chokehold his fears have over him. I could see him putting something like that.
He's like, this will help.
Yeah.
The poster specifically says, fear God alone.
Which I can see that making sense for that character. But in the context of the book and in the context of Triss, she is like constantly finding forms of security. Like, even though she has left abnegation for this new wild life where people get tattoos and learn self-defense.
They wear skirts.
They wear skirts. You can see her shoulders. So much of Dauntless in terms of like a culture is just like, they are not hyper repressed. Like, that's what it feels like to me. And yet, at the same time, Triss is, after being free of a very repressive subculture, finding ways to like rediscover that and reintegrate it with her. And it feels to me, it feels like the story of someone who, sci-fi nature aside, was raised in a very like locked down, I would keep saying this buzzword, but like repressive environment, was able to leave that environment for a comparatively more wild sort of existence for some chunk of their youth. And then, after a period of time, rediscover the aspects of the way that they were raised and the way that it worked for them and the way that they found comfort in it, and integrate that back into this new version of themselves. And it's just very interesting to me that a big portion of that has to do with the invocation of not even like religious imagery, but just like the notion of like piety. Just very interesting to me.
It is very interesting. I also find it interesting that Abnegation considers dying in combat a good death. They consider that selfless if you die in combat.
Or at least die in place of someone else.
Yeah, which I feel like that could also be explored, but I don't have the mental fortitude to do that.
My two favorite characters are Triss's mom and dad.
Oh, Triss's mom is pretty great.
The line that we get at the end, one of the most descriptive lines in the book, of Triss's mom loading a gun like she's threading a needle. Triss's mom's story is fascinating, going from this highly like liberated, aggressive faction and then choosing a peaceful one and seemingly being fine with it. And yet at the same time, she's like a warrior underneath.
Yeah.
Fascinating character arc.
I think it's like when Triss basically like recontextualizes every, even like minute expression that she's ever seen her mom do with the lens of like, oh, she was dauntless. I think that's really interesting.
And then her dad, who at one point near the end says, you shouldn't kill people. You don't get that right to choose. And Triss is like, I will if it comes down to it. And in the next scene, we get a little bait and switch. Triss is actually under fire and she hides. And then her dad kills the assailants. And it's like, this to me is the theme where it's like, even the people that with privileged information were genetically designed to be like not full humans and like be more selfless and pious, you still can't constrain that. Triss's father, when push comes to shove, will do the thing, will do the human thing of it's them or me. And whatever, his character arc, I guess, is completed, and then he dies within a few pages of the mom. And I'm like, well,
I remember seeing that a lot of people were disappointed that, in particular, Triss's mom dies so early in the series, because I think people felt like we missed out on getting that exploration. Fun fact, spoilers for the last book, Triss's mom actually was not born in that city. She was basically like put in by the scientist who did the experiment to infiltrate and try to stop Erudite from killing Divergents. Basically, like, they're on the outside being like, this is not going the way we thought it should. And then she comes in and they're like, okay, you have to go in and become a spy or like whatever, a mole in the experiment. But I think it's just, that's another reason why Allegiant is like weird, because then it takes like everything that she does in the first book and puts like another weird lens on it where you're kind of like, why did you do that if you're supposed to be like,
why didn't you join Erudite then?
Yeah.
Where best to stop it than in the faction that's doing it, than the faction that won't do anything?
I guess because Abnegation is the governing body. But I think the thing is, like, you don't see anything that her parents are doing to, like, change policies against Divergence or, like...
Yeah.
It's literally like, don't ever talk about it. We won't tell you why. No one even knows that this exists except for people in leadership.
Because you want the mystery in the book.
Yeah. But I do agree, Triss's mom and dad are very interesting characters. Also, it's revealed that Triss's dad used to be Erudite. But he hates Erudite.
But that's like another thing, because even at the end of this book, he's like sewing a wound, and she's like, I didn't know he knew how to sew. He's like, there's a lot of things you don't know about me. And I was like, oh, this is going to be so interesting to learn about him. Oh, he's dead.
Yeah. There's something about the fact that Erudite is like the quote evil faction, and that the lust for knowledge is so frequently equated to greed in this book. It feels like the opposite of the mysterious Benedict Society, where like intelligence is celebrated, especially among children, where in Divergent, intelligence is considered bad.
I think it's an unfortunate pairing. A lot of the language that Erudite uses is about prosperity.
Yeah.
And they feel more like malicious, like
Capitalists?
technocratic, like Silicon Valley types, but with all the varnish taken off.
Yeah.
If you want
That's
to get
perhaps
like
too much. If you work at Silicon Valley, you're fine. But it's like,
but if you do get like
iconography,
like economic systems and political systems, the book makes, at least Divergent, I don't know about the rest of them, but the book makes a very like roundabout, almost push against capitalism. And I don't think it intends to do that. It almost says that like, no, we need the government to give people things that when they need it.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. But I don't think it meant to do that. So it's,
I don't know.
there's a lot of commentary on like the very specific, like the smart people are the bad guys online. But I agree. I think it was just like an unlikely pairing that sort of like goes wrong.
Well, it's also in sci-fi, if you need your villain to be wielding the tools of your sci-fi world competently, they kind of need to be the smart ones, I suppose. But
I did want to talk about her final test, her final serum test, which the fact that it's serum is so like, ooh, crazy sci-fi. The goal of the test is to overcome her fears.
Yeah.
And the way she does that, and she basically says that the solution to facing powerlessness is to regain power.
Sorry, that line made me laugh when I read it.
And so she does that basically by shooting all of her fears with a gun over and over and over again.
that is one way to do it.
And for me, this is the encapsulation of either what is wrong with Dauntless or maybe what's wrong with the book, but I'm choosing to pick what's wrong with Dauntless because that can't be right. The solution to overcoming powerlessness, to overcoming fear, is to accepting your fear, like feeling it and then letting it go, right? Like that's how you prove yourself fearless, is by letting the thing that is scaring you happen because you no longer fear it.
Yeah.
It's not to shoot it with a gun.
No, I think you're right in saying it's what's wrong with Dauntless, because that is like how the big erudite plot works, is we're going to put them all in a simulation, and we've all trained them in this process to shoot their fears.
Yeah.
And we're going to mind warp them into, I don't know, it's unclear what the simulation is like, but we're going to mind warp them into a space where they have been trained to shoot their fears.
Yeah.
And then we'll have them shoot
You know the scene in Kung Fu Panda where Po and Tai Lung are like fighting over the scroll and the scroll gets knocked up to a roof and Po goes like, oh, it's up there. And he thinks really hard and imagines the scroll as a bowl of noodles and he's able to use that to like encourage himself to climb up the building. I imagine like Triss is in the simulation and she sees the flock of crows and she thinks gun, 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 gun. And a gun appears and she's like, bang, 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 bang. And she turns around and it's like, I don't know, like a water tank. She's like, gun, 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 gun. And a gun appears. She's like, bang, bang, bang.
Well, she doesn't shoot.
Yeah. But you...
No, I did think that the solution to the crow problem was manifesting a gun felt like cheating. So here's the thing, right? Like the whole point of being divergent is that you know when you're in a simulation and so the simulations can't control. It's kind of like lucid dreaming.
Yeah.
Because you know you're in a simulation so you know you can control what happens in it. So for example, in one of the simulation tests, like when they're training, Triss is trapped in a glass box and then she turns the glass into ice or like basically thin enough that she can just break it. And 4 is basically like, you can't do that because that shows that you know that it's a simulation and that you broke it. But then when they go to the fear landscape, suddenly he says, no, you will know that you're in a simulation and so it's okay to do whatever you want.
Yeah.
If the point was to weed out divergence, but you're just letting everyone be in the simulation like a divergent, then...
I think the point of those simulations were literally about training the Dauntless to be more susceptible to the mind.
That's true, yeah. I didn't think about that where it just turns into Triss shooting everything.
And I wish the book
made it clear.
Highlighted that.
Yeah.
Because that is
really
clever.
Great.
That's really great. And if the book just like put a little pin on that, like Triss is like, that's weird. Like I thought I needed to hide my divergence, but I guess that's my advantage here now.
Yeah.
If they just like poke, you know?
Yeah.
So close.
So close. Sort of.
I think that's the thing about this book is like sometimes I'm like, okay, this doesn't make sense, but the book isn't acknowledging that it's not making sense. So maybe it's just me.
Right.
Or like it doesn't feel as intentional, even if Veronica Roth maybe meant for it to be intentional, which is why I think it like keeps falling flat for me. In the movie, I wanted to watch the scene of her final test to see how they adapted it because I forgot. They actually make the final test much more straightforward. So for the crows, instead of shooting them, she runs into a field that's on fire because I think they combine a couple of her fears. So the field is on fire and she's being attacked by crows. So she goes and she takes a branch and like sets it on fire to like ward off the crows. And then she's like tied to a stake and the fire is getting closer. So then she uses the fire to like untie herself. So it's a much more straightforward, like I'm facing my fear and I'm using it to like help me get out of the situation. 4 basically tells her, like, solve it like you would if you weren't divergent. But also don't be too slow about it because then you'll, like, fail the test.
But the alternative way of solving it is just to calm down and lower your heart rate.
Yeah.
Which I guess isn't very climactic.
I don't know if they explained that in the movie. They might have, like, gotten rid of that. Because that was also confusing to me where it's like, you can either face your fear or you can just be zen and, like, meditate it away. So that's what they did in the movie. The biggest change, actually, because, okay, I wanted to talk about it because I was just like, this would be absolutely horrifying if this happened to me. When she's facing her fears, one of her fears is like fear of intimacy with 4.
Yeah.
Which
makes sense.
Makes sense.
But
weird that there's a bunch of guys watching it.
Yeah, Dauntless leaders are watching this happen. Like the other students don't see it, which is also funny to me. Not in this context, but like imagine being in a classroom where you're watching your fellow students take a test, but all that they're doing is like punching the air. It's like they're doing like VR. When you watch someone do VR, if you're not looking at what they're looking at, it just looks like they're like swiping at air. That's basically what they're watching people do.
But then on top of that, starts making out with the air, and you're like, what's happening in there?
It's like the thing where you turn around and wrap your arms around your back. And
that's my other thing is like, when she speaks in the simulation, does she actually speak out loud? Because they do say like people like scream out loud. Anyway, so I don't
think about it.
The point is she has this fear of intimacy with 4. No one else knows that it happened, not even 4 because he wasn't watching, but all the Dauntless leaders know because they're watching. And I was just like, that would be absolutely mortifying. But in the simulation, he tries to have sex with her and then she's like, I'm not going to sleep with you in a hallucination. And
which was a wild line.
In the movie, they change it to basically sexual assault.
Oh.
Yeah. Where 4 walks up to her and he's like, you should sleep with me. Not like, he doesn't say that, but then
that's a valid fear.
They're like making out and then he like tries to lift up her shirt and she like pushes him away and then he pushes her onto the bed and then he says, what's wrong? Aren't you dauntless? And then she has to beat him up to get out of it.
Oh my God.
Which is just a starkly different, like,
wow.
That was crazy to me.
I do think it, as a piece of narrative, pairs very nicely with the ending fight. I like that her ending fight is against 4.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's an interesting scale of stakes and power. And it's that weird sort of like that fear coming to life. Whether it's the movie version or the book version, it's an interesting...
Yeah. I guess like you could say in the movie, it's less about her fear of intimacy with 4 and more sort of like her fear of him potentially using his power over her.
Yeah.
Which I think is an improvement.
To his advantage. Yeah. Which then, like you said, becomes more of like a reality when she does actually have to fight him because he's under a different simulation at the end.
Mm-hmm. Someone could adapt Divergent and make something really compelling. I really believe that.
Yeah.
I think someone could take this story, take the bones of it, and make something that really has something to say about culture and society.
They could do that.
They could do that.
Alternatively.
They couldn't.
They could just make out. No.
We could have what we have. And what we have is this. I listened to this on audiobook on YouTube.
Ooh.
Where every book begins with, "This is Audible." And the top comment, assuming it's not a bot, reads, "I love that Tobias falls for Triss, not because she is pretty, but because of her character and who she is as a person. Not to be cheesy, but it's so true." And man, isn't that just what it's all about?
Oh, great job, Veronica Roth. You did it.
You did it.
You did it. One last thing. I think there's an alternate way you can look at this book that I haven't really considered a lot, so I don't really know like how it works. But the word divergent is very close to the word neurodivergent. And just looking at it straight up as divergents are literally neurodivergent. And to be someone who has all these expectations of like fitting into very strict societal norms is something like being expected to fit into like very strict like social behaviors.
Yeah.
Like being neurodivergent and not understanding like all like the social cues that you're quote unquote supposed to, I think is a very clear like analogy here that I don't think is intentional at all. But I think it really works. Like ADHD or autism or anything could be easily put in here as a metaphor. And all of the like factions could be put in as like ways you're supposed to interact with the world or interface with the world as someone who's not neurodivergent. I think that's an interesting way you could look at it.
That
all
is
the Force stuff, that all gets thrown out the window. I don't know how that works in at all. But just the system that's built, that could be a very interesting and nice way to look at it, I think. It would add a lot to the story.
That's
I
really
agree.
great.
So our final wrap-up question, how many fears do you have? No. If you had to pick
Oh my
a
gosh.
faction.
No, sorry.
If you
Going
had to
on the
pick a
fears thing.
Okay.
There was like one line that was really cheesy where like Triss gets out of the simulation and Four's like, I heard you only had 7 fears. That's pretty great. And she's like, well, now it's 6 because I faced one of them. And he's like, they can call you 6. And then it's like 4 and 6. And I was like, what? What is happening? Sorry. Okay.
4 and 6. And the ship name is Fix or
That's pretty good.
Soar. 46. I don't know.
Sorry. What were you saying?
6'4".
If you had to pick a faction to live in for the rest of your life, and not just the faction, the job that comes with the faction, your
Yeah, that's
career,
arguably more important.
way more important.
Because if I thought about it, I'd be like, I would probably choose Amity because being kind is something I try to strive for. But I don't know if I would want to be a farmer.
Yeah.
Work in the fields.
I don't know if that life is for me.
Job choices: farmer, security, politician, scientist, lawyer. I don't want to be a lawyer.
Guess I would probably be erudite then.
I don't
I
want to
think-
be any of these.
There's no creative.
Or factionless, which is apparently janitor.
There's no arts in this.
Yeah, there's no artist.
entertainment industry.
Yeah.
That's probably factionless then.
I think I would probably be erudite just because it has the widest array of things that you could go into, I feel like.
Does it?
Mm.
What do they do? We don't know.
I don't know. Like, I like doing labs in school, so you
Serums.
could be like a scientist or...
It's the pursuit of knowledge.
Yeah.
Which means that anything...
And the knowledge is so vast that
Yeah.
I feel like I could... There's something
No,
I
I
could...
don't trust it. See, we're in a creative field. We look at the STEM field, and we may as well be looking at a Rorschach test.
I was
It could
really-
be anything to us.
I was really good at math and science.
Well,
actually.
then I'll take your word for it.
My
I'm
parents
sure you
were
know
like,
what you're about.
why aren't you going into a math or science? And I said, because I don't like it. If I took
Well-
the aptitude test, I would probably get erudite. And if there was like another creative faction, then I would choose that. That's like kind of the equivalent.
It's wild to me that one of the tests, aptitude tests, is dog. Evil dog come at you, and they're like, knife or cheese? And a lot of people are like, knife. When cheese is so clearly an option. Does that make me abnegation or whatever it is?
No, hold
Amity?
on. If you go
no,
with the cheese,
thing is,
then
you choose it before you even know the dog is a threat.
Oh.
Yeah, you literally just have to pick one up by instinct, and then the dog shows up. So the reason
I'm
why...
going for cheese.
So, okay, if we understand that most people go for cheese, which is reasonable, unless you're, oh my gosh, if you're lactose intolerant, there's no way you end
There's
up in
no win.
abnegation.
Yeah. Or alternatively, right? What if you're Dauntless and you walk in and you go, oh, cheese. I love cheese. You pick up the cheese, the knife disappears. Then you turn around, there's a dog, and you're like, I wish I had the knife, but I picked the cheese because I like cheese.
But it's about how you react. So, yeah, you can get the cheese, but if you then see the dog,
You
and
throw
you're,
the cheese at it.
you huck the cheese or you bite the cheese and you're like, last meal, and you just run at the dog.
Yeah.
Anyway, no, I'd pick Amity. I want to be a farmer.
Amity sounds nice. I can't be in the sun that long.
That's fair.
And honestly, that's backbreaking work.
Yeah.
That's true. I'm imagining like a little garden like my mom has. But no, they're working like in a wheat field. I'm going to reconsider.
Yeah, it's vast.
I'm going to erudite with Victoria.
I am going to abnegation because, gosh dang it, just let me sit somewhere.
I think
and
abnegation
knit.
would be my second choice.
It's.
But absolutely not Dauntless. I would die immediately.
I
No.
think erudite it would be great, but I think they're going to be very efficiency minded.
Mm.
And gosh dang it, I just.
But Michael, they have
Abnegation isn't so
Teslas.
I will sit down somewhere and just kind of like look at that sunset and be like, yeah, you know.
But Michael, that's selfish because you could be using that time to
Yeah.
help people in need.
Well, yeah.
You shouldn't be thinking about what will make your life most comfortable. You have to be thinking about what makes
Yeah.
other people's life most
Amity,
comfortable.
they have ukuleles and hacky sack.
All right, we'll get up. Fine. I'll join. Y'all are going to Erudite, so I'll join you in Erudite, and we can all be together.
And then we'll make podcasts.
I don't think they would allow podcasts in Erudite. They'd be like, what is this?
No, they release articles and stuff. They
Yeah,
gotta
no,
have
that's true.
podcasts.
Yeah.
They gotta have podcasts.
That's how they disseminate their propaganda. We'll make propaganda podcasts for them.
Someone's got to edit their podcast.
There it is.
Yeah.
Oh, that's hell. Oh, it's hell.
Someone's got to make graphic designs for their
Sorry.
newspapers.
Oh,
One
gosh.
last thing. Actually, no, I'll say this off mic. Never mind.
No, say it on mic.
On
say
mic.
it on mic.
On mic.
Say it on mic.
They talk about what some of the other initiation processes are like. Dauntless, we know because Triss goes through it. Candor is apparently like they just inject you with truth serum.
Wait, yeah. Like, how are
Or you
supposed
take
to
like
prove,
lie detector tests.
How are you supposed to prove you're truthful if you're just injected with a truth serum and you have no choice?
You probably get a choice like, all right, here's your final test. Do you want to be injected with truth serum and reveal all your truths to everyone?
Christina says the reason why they do it is because basically their assumption is if you've already basically like revealed all of your deep, dark, embarrassing secrets, then you'll never tell another. Like you have no reason to lie anymore because you've already aired out
Wild.
all your secrets, I guess.
That's a challenge. You just have to get another darker secret.
Yeah.
I don't remember if they said what erudite or amities
I
is.
assume Erudite's just like a test.
Yeah.
But apparently abnegations is, oh, hang on, I gotta find it.
That was interesting.
30 days of charity work, and then you all sit in a room and go, yeah, I'll be nice. And then the elders wash your feet.
Yes.
Something like that.
Okay, I literally wrote down the page.
Another kind of,
Okay.
to me anyway, feels like
Their
a religious
initiates
metaphor.
spend 30 days performing community service before they can become full members. Then they sit side by side on a bench, and one of the older members reads the Abnegation Manifesto. And then the older members wash the initiate's feet, and then they all share a meal, each person serving food to the person on his left. And I was like, so the initiation process for abnegation is just, what would Jesus do?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah. Like, Jesus washed his disciples' feet, and then they shared a meal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he did a lot of community service.
And curious that they say they have a manifesto when I thought Dauntless said they had like a constitution or a charter.
Yeah.
Unless they also said manifesto.
Well, the manifesto is basically just a short paragraph about forgetting the self and the dangers of self-involvement.
Well, sure.
So it's,
Yeah.
I think maybe manifesto is the wrong
I'm
word.
reading too into
But it's basically just like, here's what we value. Welcome. I don't know.
Welcome.
Yeah.
Well, maybe
Have
I
some
should go
peas.
amnesty. I'm imagining taking like another standardized test, and I don't think I can do that.
How do they test
Well,
you?
remember, you'd be
How do
16.
they test your kindness?
That's true.
Is my real question.
Oh, that could get dark.
Yeah.
Like they put you
What?
in a desperate situation, and then they give you a choice to help someone else, and like
Oh, they just freaking manipulate
That's the
you?
thing is like kindness to
gaslight
me.
you.
Ugh.
Kindness to me feels adjacent to selflessness.
I feel like it'd be similarly chill as abnegations.
Yeah. I don't
hope
know.
so.
Anyways,
When they visited,
Candor
they were
is too. I would never be
Yeah.
in Candor.
No.
That sounds so stressful.
I just don't understand what Candor is for.
I don't think anyone understands what Candor is for.
People do make fun of Candor a lot too.
That's why they needed to attack Abnegation. No. If you have a bunch of soldiers, right, and you
Yeah.
march into a group of people who are basically Amish, you
Mm.
don't need to attack them. They're not going to hurt you.
Yeah.
That's messed up, right? Because like that's a whole part of their creed, right? They're not
Mhm.
going to hurt you. Don't kill them. You don't need to kill them.
Like, why do you even need like a whole trained task force
Yeah.
to do it?
You could literally just walk into their town hall and be like, hey, I disagree. Can we talk about this? And they'd probably say, yeah, because that's their vibe.
Well, no, I think the implication is that Erudite has been pushing against Abnegation's leadership for a while, but they can't like usurp their power for some reason.
Just like give them Teslas. I don't know.
That's what they want, though.
I did think it was
But we
interesting.
can't give you Teslas because we're helping the poor.
No,
too
I did think it was
much.
interesting that one of Erudite's arguments is like, oh, like the reason why other people can't have nice cars and stuff is because Abnegation is giving all our resources to the factionless. And then Triss notes when she goes to Erudite and Janine takes Triss back home to Dauntless in like a really nice silver car. And I was like, clearly Erudite's
Solar-powered
doing
car.
pretty well. Anyways.
One quote I found interesting. Erudite promotes a return to the democratically elected political systems of the past. It makes a lot of sense, which makes me suspect it as a call for revolution wrapped up in the clothing of rationality. What does that mean?
It could mean a lot
Okay,
of things. It's
I-
interesting to think about. in the context of
I
its
understand
world
what
and
she's
ours.
saying in terms of like, that's what propaganda is, where
Yeah.
like it presents a somewhat revolutionary idea, but wraps it nicely in a bow.
Doesn't even have to be revolutionary.
That's true. It's just like an idea.
appealing idea.
And it's like, hey, we want to do this. Doesn't that sound nice? And you're like, well, I can't think of any reason why it wouldn't be nice, but then underlying is like their true purpose or whatever. But it is weird to be like, yes, they want us to go back to democracy. That sounds suspicious. Very interesting commentary. So many things to unpack in this book. Which is why I was most excited to talk about it with you guys, because I was like, am I the only one who's like picking up on these?
Victoria, are you divergent?
Ooh, I'm not like the other girls.
She shakes her head. Look where they got us. Human beings as a whole cannot be good for long before the bad creeps back in and poisons us again.
It definitely has the message, which I strongly disagree with and dislike, of like humans are inherently bad. And so we must do things to like weed out the bad, essentially.
Well, I mean, that's the fact. Or no, that's Janine. Doesn't matter. Got
That's
it.
her mom. That's her mom saying that.
That's
That's Triss's mom. Triss's mom's like, humans are inherently bad, but like, I don't know
See,
why she
that
says
but
that.
also-
she's under deep cover.
Yeah, that
guess-
doesn't make
I
any
guess.
sense when you think about her supposedly being. Anyways, we're not going to put this in.
Doesn't matter.
I don't
We
know.
had a great time talking. Hey, this is the point of art, right? It got us talking for 2 hours.
Yeah.
Mhm. And now Victoria's going to edit it down to a tight 15 minutes.
No.
And we're not going to be
This
cutting
might just
any
be a long
important points.
episode. That's okay.
That's okay. Hey,
Yeah.
thanks for listening.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hope you enjoyed our maybe convoluted analysis of Divergent, but we had a good time talking about it, so we hope you did too. If you have any additional thoughts about Divergent, feel free to leave us a comment in the comment section or send us an email at nostalgiclubpodcast@gmail.com. We also have some social media. Our Instagram is at Nostalgia Club Podcast, and we do have a Twitter, but we don't use it.
Oh, we have a blue sky. Do we have a blue sky?
No, we don't.
We don't have a blue
We
sky.
have a blue sky for MouseKnight Studios.
Hey, listen to Ghost Inspectors.
Yeah.
Available anywhere you want.
Write in. Tell us where you want it.
We'll send it there.
Well, don't tell me. Tell Victoria or Gino.
And until next time.
Look forward to our analysis on Insurgent and Allegiant because we're reading all 3 books.
And separate episodes about each corresponding movie.
And then the,
Wait,
and
there's
then the
also-
special 4.
Yeah,
the
there's
4
4
one.
books. There's 4 shorts. Wow. There's 4 short stories about 4 that then got combined into one book called 4.
And apparently, he sounds exactly like Triss.
Great.
I believe it.
Yeah,
Hey, they're compatible, right?
they're both
We
Divergent.
didn't even talk about how they age up 4 in the movie.
They what?
So,
Wow, you hit a pitch
They made
there.
it worse?
yeah, so 4 is 18 and Triss is 16 in the book, but then in the movie, they were like, well, he definitely doesn't look 18, so we're going to age him up a little bit. But they don't ever explicitly say that. But it's just kind of like, it's obvious because he looks like a grown man. And so people assume that he's probably 23 to 24. And I think they
24.
aged Triss up to 18 so that it's
You would have
legal.
You, yeah.
Anyway, sorry. That's a
In-
side note.
Interesting.
Until next time, are you divergent? If so, never talk about it to anyone. Also,
We're not going to answer why that is.